a worker, attempting to take a shortcut through a remote part of Isla Carnero. As he pushed his way through the dense vegetation, something unusual caught his eye. Half submerged in the tangled underbrush, barely visible above the stagnant water, lay an old army duffel bag. With a cautious hand, he reached down and unzipped the worn-out bag, but the moment he peeled back the fabric, a wave of sheer horror crashed over him. Without wasting a second, he fumbled for his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed emergency services. His voice quivered as he relayed what he had just uncovered. Law enforcement swiftly arrived, securing the area and blocking off the site as forensic specialists moved in to examine the contents of the bag. DNA testing later revealed the identity of the victim. The body belonged to Ivonne Baldelli. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. In this true crime case, we will examine the incident involving Ivonne Baldelli, who was born on June 30, 1969, in a quaint and picturesque town nestled in the southern part of California. She was the youngest of 3 children born to Marjorie and James Fold, following her older brother Michael and her sister Michelle. From an early age, Ivonne shared an incredibly strong bond with her siblings, particularly with Michelle, with whom she confided in and sought comfort throughout her life. Their childhood was filled with laughter and companionship, yet it was not without its share of hardships. Tragedy struck the Fold family when Yvonne's mother fell seriously ill. The illness lingered for years, casting a somber shadow over their household. Yvonne, despite her tender age, tried to remain strong, offering whatever little support she could to her mother. However, when Yvonne was just 13, her mother succumbed to the illness, leaving the family shattered and grieving. The pain of losing her mother at such a formative age left a lasting impact on Yvonne, shaping the course of her life in ways she could never have anticipated. Her father, James, attempted to heal from the profound loss and provide a stable home for his children. Just a year after Marjorie's passing, he remarried a kind and compassionate woman who embraced his children as her own. Unlike many tales of bitter step-family dynamics, this union was peaceful, and the children grew close to their stepmother, finding in her a source of warmth and maternal affection. The home gradually regained a semblance of happiness, though the void left by their mother never truly disappeared. Yvonne was determined to build a successful future for herself. She pursued a well-rounded education and dabbled in various career paths, yet her true passion lay in fashion design. She possessed a keen eye for aesthetics, and her dream was to turn her talent into a thriving business. She worked tirelessly to refine her skills, envisioning a future where her designs would be worn by many. Unfortunately, despite her aspirations and relentless effort, she never managed to establish her dream company on a large scale. Yet she remained hopeful, continuously striving to bring her artistic vision to life. While she sought success in her professional life, her personal life was riddled with misfortune. Yvonne entered into marriage twice, hoping each time to find the love and stability she longed for. However, both unions ended in heartbreak, dissolving for reasons that left her feeling betrayed and disillusioned. To add to her sorrow, a medical complication from surgery in her youth left her unable to have children. This devastating reality weighed heavily on her, and though she tried to move past it, the longing to be a mother never truly faded. After her second marriage to Kevin Baldelli ended in divorce in 2007, Yvonne found herself living alone in her cozy apartment. The loneliness was softened only by the presence of her beloved dog, whom she affectionately referred to as her child. She built a life for herself around close family connections, ensuring she remained in touch with her father and sister. Despite the physical distance between them, she made it a priority to visit at least once a month and called them nearly every day, seeking the love and familiarity that had always grounded her. As she approached her 40th birthday in 2009, Yvonne was eager to embrace a new chapter in her life. She yearned for a fresh start, for the companionship that had long eluded her. It was during this time that she met Brian Brimager, a man who seemed to embody everything she had been searching for. Tall, tanned, and physically fit, Brian exuded charm and confidence. He was charismatic, persuasive, and knew exactly how to captivate a woman's heart. Yet beneath his seemingly perfect exterior Brian harbored dark secrets. At the time they met, he was still legally married and raising a young son with his wife. Despite his commitment, he was unfaithful, eager to indulge in an affair without regard for the consequences. He spun a web of lies, convincing Ivonne that his marriage was all but over, that he was trapped in an unhappy union solely for the sake of his child. His words struck a chord with Ivonne, who understood the pain of a troubled marriage and the difficulty of breaking free. Believing that his son was the only thing preventing him from leaving, she saw no harm in waiting. She was patient, convinced that love would ultimately prevail. But Ivonne was not the only woman Brian was deceiving. He had honed the art of manipulation, maintaining multiple romantic entanglements simultaneously. In addition to Ivonne, he was secretly involved with another woman, a striking blonde named Christine Verhoeven. Christine was not just another conquest. With her extensive connections and influence, she was a powerful figure, the kind of woman who could shape destinies. When Ivonne discovered the truth, she was devastated. She refused to be just another pawn in Brian's game. Fueled by both heartbreak and determination, she resolved to confront the situation head-on. Gathering her courage, she reached out to Brian's wife, exposing his infidelity not just with herself, but with multiple women. The revelation sent shockwaves through his marriage, forcing Brian into a difficult corner. The scandal escalated, and he was left with no choice but to decide between his crumbling family life and his mistress's. Whether out of true affection or coercion, Brian ultimately chose Ivonne. Within months, he officially divorced his wife and moved in with her. Despite securing the man she had fought for, Yvonne's family remained wary. They sensed something insincere about Brian and questioned his true intentions. But Yvonne, blinded by love, dismissed their concerns. She believed that he was sincere, that their love was real, and that they were destined to be together. As their relationship progressed, Brian began voicing his discontent with his current life. He spoke of drastic changes, of escaping the suffocating routines of city life, of starting anew in a tropical paradise. Yvonne, always willing to support him, embraced the idea wholeheartedly. She saw this as an opportunity to finally build the life she had always wanted, with the man she adored. By September 2011, the decision was final. Yvonne and Brian planned to leave behind their old lives and relocate to the serene island of Carino in Panama. The island, with its pristine beaches and untouched beauty, promised the fresh start they both desired. It was supposed to be their paradise, their escape from the burdens of the past. Before leaving, Yvonne informed her family of her plans. They pleaded with her to reconsider, to think about the risks of leaving everything behind for a man whose loyalty had been questionable at best. But Yvonne was resolute. Love had blinded her to any doubts or fears. She resigned from her job, sold her apartment, and began packing for what she believed would be the beginning of her happily ever after. With the intention of realizing her long-cherished ambition of starting a small business where she could design, create, and sell personalized clothing to tourists visiting the island, Yvonne carefully packed her sewing machine along with a few pieces of clothing and essential supplies. She had envisioned turning her passion for fashion design into a thriving venture that would allow her to live out her dream in paradise. Brian, Yvonne, and her beloved dog eagerly boarded a flight to Panama in early September, filled with hope for their new adventure. After spending a few days exploring the nation's capital and adjusting to the new environment, they embarked on the final leg of their journey by taking a ferry to Carino Island. The island, spanning just 1 square kilometer, was breathtakingly beautiful, surrounded by crystal-clear waters and endless sandy beaches. The couple rented a modest home right by the sea, hoping to settle into a peaceful, idyllic lifestyle. The climate remained consistently hot and humid throughout the year, making it an attractive destination for surfers and divers from around the world. However, the island had a dangerous side. Its interior was covered in dense jungle and perilous swampland teeming with venomous snakes, spiders, and other dangerous creatures. For this reason, nearly all the infrastructure, including bars, shops, and homes, was concentrated along the coastline. Brian, who had been a gifted guitarist since childhood, saw this as an opportunity to reignite his musical passion. He had always dreamed of performing professionally, and now, with the relaxed island atmosphere and numerous beachside bars, he believed he could finally make a name for himself. Within just a week of arriving, he had already made connections with several bar owners. One particularly friendly establishment owner offered him a regular gig playing music in the evenings. While Brian enjoyed the attention and camaraderie of the audience, he quickly developed an unhealthy habit. His admirers would frequently buy him drinks as a token of appreciation, leading him to indulge in alcohol almost every night. Meanwhile, Ivonne was pouring her energy into her new business. However, her dream was slow to take off. Sales were minimal, and despite her best efforts, profits were nearly non-existent. Still, she refused to give up. Determined to make ends meet, she took on additional work at one of the island bars while continuing to build her fashion business. In addition to her job and personal projects, Ivonne adopted another dog she found wandering the island, providing the animal with a loving home. Despite the challenges she faced, she maintained close contact with her sister Michelle Valenzuela, sharing daily updates about her life. But over time, Michelle noticed a change in her sister's messages. They became shorter, less cheerful, and increasingly filled with frustration and sadness. For the first few months, the couple appeared to be living in paradise. Ivonne remained hopeful that Brian would eventually propose to her, envisioning a romantic beachside wedding where they would exchange vows under the golden sun. However, as time passed, Brian made no move toward marriage, and the once passionate relationship began to erode. Their arguments grew more frequent, their connection strained, and Yvonne's fairy tale began to crumble. Michelle became deeply concerned when, at the beginning of December, Yvonne's messages suddenly stopped altogether. Days passed with no word from her, and then, on December 14, 2011, Michelle received an unexpected phone call from Brian. His request stunned her. He wanted to know when he could come pick up his SUV, which had been left in her garage before he and Ivonne moved to Panama. This revelation sent a wave of alarm through Michelle. Brian had returned to the United States. But where was Ivonne? Why hadn't she reached out to her family? When questioned, Brian claimed that he had already explained everything in an email sent a few days earlier. He also insisted that Ivonne had written to Michelle as well, detailing the situation. Confused and anxious, Michelle hurriedly checked her inbox. Sure enough, 2 unread messages awaited her, one from Brian and one from Ivonne. Brian's email stated that Ivonne had left him and run away to Costa Rica with a new lover. The second email, allegedly from Ivonne, mirrored his claims. It explained that she had broken up with Brian after discovering his infidelity and learning that he had fathered a child with another woman. The message went on to say that she had met someone new and had decided to relocate to Costa Rica to start a fresh chapter in her life. At first glance, the explanation seemed plausible. After all, Ivonne had always longed for a stable relationship, and learning that Brian had fathered a child with another woman, especially when she herself could not conceive, might have been devastating for her. However, something about the message didn't sit right with Michelle. Ivonne had never been one to act rashly, and she would have undoubtedly turned to her sister to discuss such a monumental change in her life. Moreover, the tone of the email felt off, subtly different from how Ivonne usually wrote. Michelle's unease deepened as she tried to track her sister's whereabouts. Every attempt to obtain information about Yvonne's current location led to a dead end. The more she searched, the more suspicious the circumstances surrounding her disappearance became. There was a disturbing lack of response to phone calls, and the messages that did arrive from Ivonne were increasingly cold and distant. They contained only brief statements such as, "I'm okay, I need some time," and "I'm not ready to talk about this." Michelle, growing more anxious with each passing day, urged Brian to accompany her to the police station to file a missing persons report. Though visibly uneasy, Brian dismissed her concerns, insisting it wasn't necessary. He assured her that Ivonne was fine, perfectly capable of taking care of herself, and that she would return on her own terms when she was ready. Despite Brian's reluctance to discuss Yvonne's disappearance and his hurried departure after collecting his car, Michelle felt a small sense of relief when a text message arrived from Yvonne's phone, stating she would be coming home for their father's birthday in January. Deciding to trust the message, Michelle chose to wait a few more weeks, holding on to the hope that her sister would return as promised. However, as mid-January arrived and Ivonne had neither returned nor sent any further messages or calls, Michelle's concern turned into full-blown fear. Suspicion deepened when she discovered that Brian had married Christine Verhoeven, the mother of his child, just before the holidays. It seemed incredibly suspicious that he had moved on so quickly, considering that he and Ivonne had supposedly broken up only weeks prior. The entire situation felt orchestrated and unnatural. Desperate for answers and increasingly convinced that Ivonne had never gone to Costa Rica as Brian claimed, Michelle took the next logical step. She formally reported her sister as missing to law enforcement. Once the case was escalated, an official investigation was launched. Authorities reached out to Panama, and the inquiry soon confirmed Michelle's worst fears. There was no evidence that Ivonne Baldelli had ever left the country. Her passport had not been used for any outbound travel, and there were no records of her crossing any border. Driven by a gnawing sense of dread, Michelle enlisted the help of her cousin, a skilled programmer, to trace the IP address of the suspicious emails supposedly sent by Ivonne. The findings were damning. The messages, which were meant to create the illusion that Ivonne was safe and had willingly left, were not sent from some remote location in Costa Rica. Instead, they were traced back to Dana Point, California, where Brian Brimmiger was living at the time. Moreover, an additional email sent by Brian originated from the same IP address, further solidifying the deception. Realizing the severity of the situation, Michelle immediately handed this crucial evidence over to the police. Her concerns deepened as she pieced together a sinister timeline. Brian had continued to impersonate Ivonne in emails and text messages for nearly a month, keeping up the facade that she was still alive and traveling. Despite the alarming nature of Michelle's discoveries, there was not yet enough concrete evidence to warrant Brian's arrest. Investigators were left with no choice but to continue gathering information and keeping a close watch on him. Meanwhile, more disturbing revelations surfaced. It was confirmed that while Brian was still living in Panama with Ivonne, he had already proposed to Christine Verhoeven. Christine, completely unaware that Brian was cohabiting with another woman, had accepted his proposal, believing that he had been away on business. Determined to take matters into her own hands, Michelle flew to Panama herself 2 months after her sister's disappearance. Once there, she sought out Don Winter, a former American intelligence officer turned private investigator who specialized in locating missing Americans abroad. She recounted every detail of Ivonne's story to Winter, including Brian's suspicious behavior and the misleading emails. Winter, with years of experience in high-stakes cases, immediately sensed that the situation was dire. Based on his professional judgment, he feared that Ivonne had likely met a grim fate. Winter used his deep network of connections to pressure Panamanian authorities into taking swift action. He also leveraged his expertise in high-profile cases to bring international attention to Ivonne's disappearance, turning it into a major news story. The media's coverage gained traction, with news outlets across the world reporting on the case of the missing American woman in Panama. In a desperate bid for answers, Ivonne's family members held a press conference to plead for information and assistance. As the investigation intensified, Ivonne's brother, father, stepmother, and several close family members and friends traveled to Panama to join the search efforts. They made their way to the remote island of Carino, where Ivonne and Brian had lived, and began an exhaustive search. The dense jungle, treacherous swamps, and overgrown wilderness made their efforts painstakingly difficult. Despite their persistence, they found no trace of Ivonne. Frustrated but determined, they turned to the island's residents, hoping to uncover any leads that could shed light on what had happened. What they learned was unsettling. According to locals, Ivonne and Brian had been regularly seen at various bars, frequently drinking to excess. Their arguments had become notorious, with the couple engaging in heated disputes in public, often ignoring those around them. Witnesses described intense drunken fights that escalated into shouting matches, with Ivonne at times appearing visibly distressed. It was clear that their once romantic dream of living in paradise had turned into something much darker, a volatile and possibly dangerous situation. In addition to the troubling revelations about Ivonne's sudden disappearance, people in her social circle and community began to take greater notice of the visible bruises and scrapes that marred her face and torso. Her usual lively and radiant expression had been replaced with a quiet, guarded demeanor, and she rarely appeared in public without wearing sunglasses, even in the evening or on overcast days. It was as though she were attempting to hide the damage behind her eyes, shielding herself from scrutiny while carrying an invisible weight of fear and secrecy. Neighbors of the house where she had lived reported unsettling occurrences to the property owner, claiming that loud, aggressive arguments frequently broke out within its walls. On multiple occasions, they overheard the sounds of shouting, objects being smashed, and profanities being hurled, often escalating into what sounded like physical altercations. These reports only reinforced suspicions that something terrible had happened behind closed doors. Meanwhile, law enforcement intensified their efforts, deploying a team of specialized divers to search the waters surrounding the remote island for any trace of Ivonne's remains or belongings that might provide a clue to her fate. Yet despite exhaustive searches, their efforts yielded nothing. No body, no personal effects, no clear signs of what had transpired. From the very beginning, Brian Brimmiger was considered the primary suspect in the case. His behavior and Ivonne's history of injuries cast a dark shadow over him. But there was a critical problem. There was no direct evidence tying him to a crime. Without a body or clear proof of foul play, authorities were unable to charge him with anything more than suspicion. Brian stuck to his narrative without deviation, insisting that Ivonne had left of her own accord after discovering that he had fathered a child with another woman. He claimed that she had simply vanished, possibly to start a new life elsewhere. But investigators found his story difficult to believe. It was only on September 21, 2012, that a search was conducted at his home. At the time of his search, Brian was unemployed and spent most of his days at home, looking after his child and indulging in his passion for golf. His wife, Christine, was the sole breadwinner, working long hours while he remained at home. Initially, Brian appeared composed and confident, repeating the same version of events he had given before. He was adamant that Ivonne had made the decision to leave him and had cut off all communication as a result. However, cracks began to show in his facade when law enforcement revealed that the last communication sent in Ivonne's name had originated from his neighborhood. He grew noticeably anxious when officers discovered her laptop, which contained crucial digital evidence that contradicted his claims. A forensic analysis of Ivonne's laptop uncovered several alarming discoveries. Not only were messages sent in her name after her supposed disappearance, but investigators also found a photograph of her with a visible bruise beneath her eye. Additionally, a screenshot of a conversation from November showed a discussion between Brian and Christine about their affair and the child they shared. Potentially, the very means by which Ivonne discovered his deception. Even more damning was the laptop's search history from November 26, 2011. Investigators found incriminating searches such as how to clean blood and how to remove blood from a mattress. Though these searches suggested an attempt to cover up a violent act, there were still no definitive signs of Ivonne's body or blood-stained evidence that could link Brian directly to a crime. While these findings raised strong suspicions, they were still largely circumstantial. The fact that Brian had been impersonating Ivonne in her messages did not, on its own, prove that he had killed her. However, the mounting evidence continued to paint an increasingly sinister picture. A breakthrough came when Don Winter, an independent investigator assisting in the case, uncovered an alarming detail. Brian had sold a machete before leaving Panama. Disturbingly, in an online chat with a prospective buyer, Brian had made a horrifying joke, claiming that he had only used the machete once to finish off a stripper. The remark was so grotesque and chilling that it prompted authorities to track down the new owner of the machete. Although forensic tests on the blade initially yielded no conclusive evidence, the nature of the joke suggested a disturbing level of callousness and possible intent. Another key aspect of the case was Brian's use of Ivonne's bank card to fabricate the illusion that she had fled to another country. To strengthen his alibi, Brian deliberately traveled to Costa Rica before returning to the United States, making strategic withdrawals from ATMs along the way. He used the missing woman's card to make several transactions in San Jose, ensuring that her financial trail suggested she had willingly left Panama. To further erase his tracks, he purchased his own travel tickets in cash and eventually disposed of the bank card entirely after emptying the funds. What Brian failed to anticipate, however, was the presence of security cameras. Footage from multiple ATMs in Costa Rica captured him using Ivonne's card, concrete proof that he had been fraudulently accessing her finances long after her alleged departure. Despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, the lack of a body remained a significant obstacle in charging Brian with murder. On July 2013, nearly a year and a half after Ivonne's disappearance, authorities finally arrested Brian Brimmiger. However, due to the absence of a clear cause of death or physical remains, he was initially charged only with fabricating statements and obstructing the investigation. By this time, his relationship with Christine had progressed, and the couple had welcomed their second child together, a baby boy born just a week before his arrest. Even when confronted with overwhelming inconsistencies in his alibi and given the opportunity to confess, Brian remained steadfast in denying any involvement in Ivonne's disappearance. His lawyer continuously emphasized the lack of a body and direct evidence, arguing that while Brian may have misled authorities, there was no concrete proof that Ivonne was dead or that Brian had played a role in her presumed demise. Then, 2 months after Brian's arrest, a shocking and significant breakthrough occurred in the case. A worker taking a shortcut through a remote part of Isla Carnero inadvertently stumbled into a marshy thicket and made a grisly discovery. Half submerged in the underbrush, barely visible above the water, was an old army duffel bag. The fabric was partially decayed from prolonged exposure to the elements. As the worker cautiously approached, a horrifying realization set in. This was no ordinary discarded bag. Driven by a natural curiosity, the man reached down and unzipped the weathered backpack, hoping to uncover something of value. Perhaps money, jewelry, or an item that might be useful. However, as he peeled back the fabric, his breath hitched in horror. His hands trembled as he recoiled, his stomach twisting with nausea. Without hesitation, he scrambled for his phone and alerted the authorities, his voice shaking as he relayed the shocking discovery. Law enforcement quickly arrived at the scene, sealing off the area as forensic teams moved in to inspect the bag. Inside, they uncovered human remains, gruesomely packed and abandoned in a location carefully chosen to ensure they would never be found. DNA testing later confirmed that the remains belonged to Ivonne Baldelli. The forensic pathologist's findings painted a horrifying picture of her final moments. She had been subjected to severe and repeated beatings before her death, as evidenced by a fractured cheekbone, a broken nose, and multiple missing teeth. The brutality of the assault suggested prolonged suffering before her life was ultimately taken. Furthermore, it became clear that her cherished dogs had likely been murdered to perpetuate the false narrative of her voluntary disappearance. A critical breakthrough in the case came when forensic specialists analyzed the chop marks on her bones, which bore the distinct signature of a machete blade. Each blade unique, akin to a fingerprint. This damning piece of evidence irrefutably linked the crime to a specific weapon. With this forensic proof, authorities formally charged Brian Brimmiger with murder and obstruction of justice. As the case against Brian progressed, tragedy struck Ivonne's family once more. At the start of 2014, Michelle Valenzuela, Ivonne's devoted sister, was diagnosed with an advanced and aggressive form of cancer. She had spent so much time consumed by the search for justice that she had neglected her own health, postponing doctor visits and ignoring warning signs. By the time she finally sought medical attention, it was too late. Her illness had reached a terminal stage. Doctors offered her intense treatments, but after 6 months of painful and ultimately ineffective therapy, Michelle made a resolute decision. Rather than spend her remaining time in a hospital bed, she chose to dedicate her final months to ensuring her sister's murderer faced justice. Despite her declining health, Michelle fought relentlessly, advocating for Ivonne in every way possible. In September 2014, doctors delivered a devastating prognosis. She had only weeks left to live. Yet, even with death looming over her, she refused to give up. Determined to see Brian face the full consequences of his actions, she chose to testify in court, recounting the horrors of her sister's case with unwavering resolve. She presented the court with every email, every text message, and every shred of evidence she had gathered over the years. After delivering her powerful testimony, she collapsed from exhaustion. 3 days later, Michelle passed away, leaving behind a legacy of unwavering courage and devotion. The prosecution presented a chilling reconstruction of the events leading up to Yvonne's death. On the night of November 26th, tensions between Brian and Yvonne reached a boiling point. After discovering more incriminating messages between Brian and Christine, Yvonne confronted him, igniting a violent argument. Intoxicated and consumed by rage, Brian launched a brutal attack, delivering fatal stab wounds to her body. He then carried out the unthinkable. He methodically killed her in the bathtub using a machete, killed her beloved dogs, and packed her remains into his military backpack. Determined to erase all traces of his crime, he disposed of the blood-stained mattress and the limbs that wouldn't fit in the bag by hurling them off a rocky cliff and into the ocean. Under the cover of night, he trekked deep into the swamps of the island and abandoned the backpack, confident that nature would conceal his crime forever. In the following weeks, Brian maintained a chilling facade of normalcy. He continued living in the same beach house, meticulously destroying any remaining evidence. He spun a web of lies, telling the islanders that Yvonne had impulsively left him for another man, painting himself as the heartbroken victim. His deception was so convincing that he even managed to attract a new girlfriend, Nicole Powell, who comforted him in the weeks leading up to his departure from Panama. However, Nicole would later become a key witness in Brian's trial. She bravely testified against him, exposing his violent tendencies and pathological dishonesty. When confronted with overwhelming forensic evidence, Brian was left with no choice but to admit partial responsibility. However, in a last-ditch effort to evade full accountability, he claimed self-defense. He insisted that Yvonne had attacked him first with a knife and that he had only acted to protect himself. He feigned memory loss regarding the brutal dismemberment, the murder of the dogs, and the systematic destruction of evidence, conveniently attributing his actions to shock-induced amnesia. But his fabricated defense crumbled under scrutiny. Investigators uncovered damning internet searches and calculated attempts to erase digital evidence, proving that Brian had methodically planned his cover-up. In the spring of 2016, Brian Brimmiger was convicted, not of first-degree murder, as Yvonne's grieving family had hoped, but of manslaughter. Instead, he received a 26-year prison sentence with the possibility of parole in 2035.